Settle down, settle down. Now, gather around, children. I have a story to tell you guys. Awake in his bed, down on his luck. A man laid there, feeling nothing but stuck. Left alone on a Saturday morning with nothing to do, an idea suddenly came through. "I'll try that amusement park," the man exclaimed, "the one my friends told me to pursue." Leaping out of his home, of course with clothes, a dilemma he loathes causes a fork in the road. The right one or the left one? The man was silent, not even a stutter. "Why not both?" the man suddenly uttered. With his mind made, he proceeded to the first attraction. His toll was paid, and the train gained traction. The first one started off with a slow but long rise. The rest of the ride was in sight, and looking ahead was to his demise. After the drop there were many hills, a constant fight with thrills from the sights up high, and the dread of falling down to the trees on the ground, before one long, fast, and final downward spiral into a slow trek past the halfway aisle. Another ramp approaches. He makes it to the top and goes downwards into speeds that make his ears pop. Adrenaline and excitement's at an all-time high, as the end of the ride becomes nigh. With more time to reflect, his inner thoughts collect. "That ride was more than fun," the man said as his head spun. "But now that I've descended, the simpler second course has given me a feeling of regret that I've none but resented. Maybe the halfway aisle is where it rightfully should have ended." He makes his way to the next ride. The second one is like a tide. It shoots him out at a high speed with twists and turns galore. But then a halt impossible to ignore slows the ride into a snore. After a short straight line, he drops back into speeds that blind. With hands in the air, the ride's design was back in its prime, but stops on a dime for a second time, rising on yet another ramp back into the high sky. "With how much I've been in the clouds, I've been looking to soar," the man roared, "but the sluggish nature of this bore makes my experience a chore to deplore." During his ascension, a huge long loop appeared as if it were magic. Halfway through, he looked ahead, and the rest of the ride boasted loops into loops, spirals into corkscrews. Exhilaration ensued. The man was ecstatic, and just as the drop was in view, the ride withdrew. The result was tragic. Ropes fell down from the seats, and the managers tell the man that the park was capiche until this ride was complete. Inflicted with deceit, the man retreats in defeat, knowing he won't be able to sleep without resolution's sigh of relief. So you're probably thinking, Dara,
what the fuck was that?
Well, rightfully confused viewer, what I just described are two of the biggest reasons as to why I think that two-parter movies are starting to get out of hand. Or get out of hand again. Back then in its heyday, two-parter movies were a fun idea turned spoiled, as companies scoured their brains looking for ways to use them as a means to make a franchise's reign last a little longer. Most times out of a knee-jerk reaction to how much money they got away with. And I'm sad to say that they're starting to become prevalent once again.
Time travel!
Now, two-parter movies have always been a thing, and they definitely weren't always a bad thing either. Back to the Future Parts 2 and 3, Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, and Kill Bill Volumes 1 and 2 are great examples of how this can work out. Each of these widely loved sagas considered to be cult classics are stories that become split off by a cliffhanger ending at some point, and then continue into the next and final film. This archetype has been used many times, but in different ways. Back to the Future 3 and Kill Bill 2 were both planned, but Kill Bill was different because Volume 1 and Volume 2 were both 1 4-hour movie split into 2 parts, whereas Back to the Future 2 and 3 were both different movies that were filmed back to back. With George Lucas going with the flow, he didn't have the privilege of releasing his movies back to back within months like the previous examples. So instead, after one of the biggest twists in movie history, fans had to wait years.
Ouch.
Now, I liked Return of the Jedi, somewhat. But Kill Bill and Back to the Future definitely laid out the groundwork for how two-parters should be made. Back-to-back finished films with halves that can stand alone with their own conclusions set in between a few months of their releases. Seems like an easy thing to follow, right? I mean, technically 12 months still count as months apart. With the movies I mentioned, the cliffhangers and extra parts never felt like they were needed. The pacing never dragged, and the movie didn't always feel like its sole purpose was to set up pins to knock down. They all had their own climaxes, conclusions, and open-ended endings. Marty getting back the almanac and fixing all of Biff's changes, leading to Doc getting struck back to the Wild West, the bride's fight against the crazy 88 and crossing one more name off her death list, only for us to be told that her daughter is actually alive, and Luke's losing fight with Darth Vader, finding out that he's his son, with Han being frozen and the rebels on the losing side of the war. Each of these movies are respected in their own rights. You could watch all of these movies and, while tempted to, never feel forced to watch the rest to get what you felt was missing. You're left wanting to finish the saga because of how much more meaning it adds to what was already there in the first place. You can watch them in isolation and still feel satisfied regardless. Unfortunately, somewhere down the road, the idea of wanting to continue the story got tossed out the window like a Quick Trip cup, pushing movies to artificially raise the suspense meter in any cheap way they could to force people to come back next time for the finished product. And it all geared into action with the YA novel boom. If you know, you know. This was the era of the dystopian/teen drama book with capitalized obscure words to describe what everyone already described broadly with simpler words, becoming reanimated into a lifeless series with an inevitable two-parter consisting of a very slow first part and a smorgasbord second part. But before then, there were two other franchises going on at the time that used these same tactics, and it's also what I think gave all these talentless hacks the idea. Harry Potter and Twilight. Twilight caught Harry Potter at the tail end of its saga, but both have two-parter movies that I can say are definitely guilty of these things. Harry Potter is obviously the better series, and Robert Pattinson would agree.
I was convinced that Stephanie was convinced she was Bella. And especially when she says, oh, it was based on a dream. And it's like, oh, I had this dream about this really sexy guy. And she just writes this book about it. It's like, this woman is mad.
The movies prior to the Deathly Hallows were a great watch and an all-around entertaining journey with strong characters, an interesting story, and a versatile set of filmmaking techniques and elements that give each entry their own flair and tone. So of course, I had to see the end. But I'm not going to sit here and act like they did it to the best of their ability. Never once in my life did I ever think to myself, you know what, I do want to rewatch the trio run away to various locations for 2 hours after Death Eaters attacked at a pointless wedding, and I definitely want to see Ron project his insecurities on Harry to spark some sort of out-of-nowhere love triangle drama. This is very important, and it did so much to change the course of the story. It totally wasn't meaningless moments after it happened, and it definitely didn't cause for the movie to end right when it was about to get started. And even though Part 2 had 2 hours to unravel whatever Part 1 was spinning up, it still felt rushed. You never once got any time to dwell on anything that was happening. It almost felt similar to The Rise of Skywalker. Whenever the movie would slow down for character growth, it would immediately kick back up because Voldemort just felt like fighting at that time, or they had to run away because of the cops chasing them. The first part leisurely set up the pins, and then Part 2 threw a baseball at them. An unsatisfying end to what could have been a great mega saga of movie adaptations. This was not the case with Twilight. There wasn't any build up towards this saga's end because there was nothing to build up to in the first place. Every movie before it was nothing but an amalgamation of glorified toxic relationships filled with unfaithfulness, control, belligerence, and downright jealousy, broken apart by the occasional wraparound back to the war between edgelords and furries. So as you can tell, I was heavily invested in seeing how it was going to end. With Part 1, it again was very slow, but it was made slower due to how god-awful the story was. We had another pointless wedding, we were tortured to painstakingly watch every lonely teen girl's wet dream, a baby happened, and then Bella became a vampire herself. The second part somehow was just as bad, with a final battle as a distraction from the garbage at the beginning, which was just a bunch of teasing for a final battle between the edgelords and furries versus the edgier edgelords, only to be a vision brought upon them by a mind-controlling power, or something. So we don't even get the smorgasbord we were promised. It's nothing more but empty filler. We barely had anything to go on in the first part, which had no lasting effects on the next part, and the next part didn't even actually count. So looking back at these franchises, it begs the question, why would they split their final movies into 2 parts if it doesn't even add up to one consistent whole? The correct answer is obviously money, but it wouldn't be the first answer. The first thing people would say to explain this phenomenon is, well, that is the biggest book of the rest. If there's so much in between the pages, of course bringing that to an audience without keeping them seated for too long would be a heavy task. So, if that is the case, tell me why Eclipse has 131 pages more than the first book, but the movies only have a 2-minute runtime difference. Breaking Dawn has 127 pages more than Eclipse, yet instead of adding a couple extra minutes, they added an entire movie's length of runtime. Why is that? Okay, Dara, that's just one example. Well, today's your lucky day, because I still have more to show. Which also is unlucky because Twilight isn't the only book to film adaptation that's done this. With Harry Potter, it gets worse. Much worse. Are you ready?
Prepare yourself.
Order of the Phoenix is 159 pages bigger than the Deathly Hallows, and yet it's the shortest movie in the series. Not only does that toss out the biggest book argument, but I also ask, where's Order of the Phoenix's second part? Did it get delayed? Is it gonna be DLC? But wait, there's more. What if I told you that it gets worse? How can it get any worse, you ask? Well, how's about both the Half-Blood Prince and the Deathly Hallows having the exact same amounts of pages?
What?
Where's Half-Blood Prince's second part? Did that get delayed too? Is that gonna be DLC? Now, the contents of the books may differ in what needed to be taken or not, but a 159-page and an entire movie's difference cannot just be happenstance. Two books having the exact same page count and yet the movies having widely contrasting runtimes cannot be coincidence. Know why? Because it happened with The Hunger Games too. Catching Fire and Mockingjay both have a one-page difference, yet Mockingjay almost doubles Catching Fire in runtime. Insurgent and Allegiant also had a one-page difference, yet Allegiant had a second part planned, but it got cancelled because people were tired of YA novels by then. That and the movies themselves were total garbage. It got to the point to where the director of the Maze Runner series had to reassure fans that his movie was a trilogy, and only a trilogy without any split parts. But the worst attempt of it all isn't even a YA novel adaptation. It's actually an adaptation of the work of Tolkien himself, The Hobbit. I, for one, have never watched any of the Lord of the Rings series, simply because I don't have the time to, but looking back at all that I listed, I don't think that adapting 3 2-hour-and-a-half films from a 320-page children's book exactly screams quality over quantity. Aside from the straggler It, which was a breath of fresh air into the horror genre that soon after became a breath too long, the era of two-parters seemingly started to die down. Or so we thought. Remember that story I brought up at the beginning? The first roller coaster represented Infinity War and Endgame, an adventure with strong footing, great arcs, and a subversive ending that actually made sense, followed by an unforgettable event that instantly becomes forgettable once you stop to look at the details. This is what brought not only two-parters back on the map, but it also started the past 2.5-hour movie wave as well. For better or worse. Endgame was a once-in-a-lifetime experience that was felt by many fans around the world. No matter who you were or where you were, someone somewhere leaped out of their seat when Cap whacked away at lesser Thanos. But do the good moments of your first watch matter if massive errors from your second or third watch start to make them only good moments in isolation? I'm one of those people who stood with the rest on opening day. It was a time I'd never forget, and a time that will never be replicated for as long as we live. But over time, my taste for Endgame soured as the problems repeatedly revealed themselves under my microscope. The sewer rat, Bulk Hanner, Fat Thor, the idiot time travel rules, the time heist, bitch-made Thanos, the spectacle fight, Cap changing not only his life, but the lives of countless others at the end. Other than the big ticket items and some funny moments, Endgame is nothing but cake and ice cream for breakfast. Yeah, it tastes good in the moment, but later you're left feeling sick and unsatisfied because it was devoid of nutrients. To be frank, I always felt that Endgame wasn't really necessary in the grander scheme of things. After Infinity War, I was constantly questioning why I didn't feel the want for anything more. It almost felt too complete. Then I went back to Empire. At the end of Empire, Han was hardened, Luke took a big loss, and the Rebel Alliance were broken apart. The big thing here is that each of these characters were left to be redeemed. That was the hint that this fight wasn't over yet. Han broke out, the Rebels defeated the Empire for good, and Luke grew into the Jedi Master he was bred to be. But when we look at Infinity War, nobody was captured. Thanos wasn't in the next phase of his plan. They were dead, snapped away. There is literally no chance at redemption past that point. There's no one to save, there's no one to break out. They're gone, dusted, without a trace. Thanos completed his plan. The war was lost. Not looked to be, not can be, it is. Which is why they brought out time travel. Death is impossible to reverse unless you counter it with something just as impossible, in 5 seconds or less. This is a perfect example of how a cliffhanger can become almost gratuitous. Because it was set up with too great of a conclusion, there isn't too much of a cliff to hang on to in the first place. Now on the other side of the spectrum, we have Across the Spider-Verse, which was my second roller coaster example. We spent time with Gwen in a cool little action sequence with some emotional beats on her sense of self. We stopped. Then we spent time with Miles and our supposed villain for another cool action sequence and more emotional beats on his sense of self. Stopped. Then spent time with Gwen and Miles after spending time with Miles' parents with even more emotional beats on both of their sense of selves. We teleported to Pavitter's dimension, found the villain, lost, saved some people, meandered with the spider blob, keep in mind the villain is at full power now, got told for the 50th time about how our decisions never mattered, ran away from the spider blob, got a good twist, and just as things started to get interesting, oh wait, there's the villain, what were you doing all this time? And cut. To be continued, whenever it continues. Everyone around me in the theater were waiting for stuff to happen before a collection of paraphrased aw mans and whats came out. But as soon as I saw them switch from Miles to Gwen and back as the music started to crescendo and I felt the climax chills build up, my immediate thought was, they're seriously not going to end this here after fondling the spider blob's balls for 50 hours. I couldn't tell you how disappointed I was after seeing those words on the screen. I managed to save my thoughts until after I analyzed them because I didn't want to be that guy who hates on the hot new movie everyone likes to look high class, hip, and cool. But unfortunately to this day, it still hasn't caught my attention to rewatch it like Into the Spider-Verse. Or if we're gonna go back to the top of this video, the likes of Back to the Future, Empire, or Kill Bill. The entire movie felt like a first and second act. There was a lot of character building and some cool sequences, but that goddamn Spider Blob segment. I have issues with Across's pacing as a whole, especially with the Miles part canceling all the build-up Gwen's part had, but I definitely felt it the most during the Spider Blob scene. Why? Because it was unnecessary. Miguel being a villain was unnecessary. The canon events were unnecessary. Spot was supposed to be the main villain, and that was it. This entire sequel should have been centered around his rise to power and Miles and company losing the fight to rise back up to save his own dimension in the next movie. Or they could have defeated Spot at the end when he threatened Miles' dimension and just left Spider-Verse alone after that, but two-parters got a two-parter, I guess. Instead, he was a running joke, then suddenly flipped into a broken villain within minutes, but for some reason, right when he has the power to rip entire dimensions apart, he disappeared at his finest hour and popped back up when Miles shipped himself to the wrong universe. When Miles was messing about with the Spider Blob, what the heck was Spot doing? Still reaching for bills in the ATM? He was supposed to be the climax for this film, not something to put off until you're ready to deal with him in the next one after being nothing but hyped up for the first half of the movie. If not Spot, then where was the climax on Across? The Spider Blob segment? When they used no other strategy than just tossing themselves at Miles despite being a super team of supposed super geniuses? Or the Miles and Miguel fight, where they just ran around Nueva York and did nothing but add more things to resolve on top of what already needed to be resolved smack at the end? What about the conclusion? Was it when Miles found out that he was the Prowler? Or when Gwen squatted up with her friends to gear up to go to his dimension, leaving more things to be left unresolved? The conflict against Spot was all that I was waiting for, and now I have to wait longer because for some reason the Spider Blob had to be a thing. It didn't help much with the story, and it only served to bloat it. Cause let's think about this for a second. With Across doing nothing but building up pins to knock down, how long is it going to take to escape Kilometers Morales and defeat Spot? I refuse to believe that with the help of Gwen and her friends that it'll take over 2 hours. Maybe it will, and they'll do it right, maybe not. I won't know until it comes out. Eventually. And therein lies the biggest annoyance, the release date, or the lack thereof. Look back at all of the examples besides Empire and It that I brought up before Across. What do they all have in common? The second part released in either a year or below. For some reason, they didn't release Across with Beyond ready like the previous films. Instead, we have to wait for what we thought was next year, then 2026, to now indefinitely to find out how it's going to end. And to be honest, I don't know if I have it in me to wait that long. I'm all for creators waiting until their projects are at a point to where they think it's complete to the best of their vision for it. But the difference here is that Across isn't even a complete film. They also didn't bother to tell anyone that this was a two-parter ahead of time, unless you closely followed the press runs and social media posts to the T, which I didn't do because I go into the media I'm consuming completely blind to keep from trailer spoiling or warped perspectives. If they just took their time and finished the films before releasing them, while I still would be upset for the way they cut it off, I would leave the theater at least knowing that the conclusion is on its way the next year. It would also give the workers ample time for breaks since they're not running against a clock. But the salt got rubbed in the wound, and it will forever sting until the next part releases. Nevertheless, Across the Spider-Verse isn't alone. Dune is yet another two-parter that also fell victim to this problem. While it has great character building and well-crafted set pieces and effects, it still suffers from the same two-parter pacing syndrome. It's really slow and lacks resolution. I will give them some leeway, being that the book is over 800 pages long. However, that does not exonerate them from not finishing both movies and releasing them in a timely manner. Yes, I do get that trusting a director whose last movie was a box office flop to jump the gun on a two-parter is risky business, but inherently speaking, two-parters are, by definition, risky business. And delaying what fans thought was coming in 2 years to now 3 to watch the aftermath of what the first part took so long to set up didn't make it any less risky, so no use in hiding behind that excuse. I should bring up Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning, but I haven't even caught up with the rest of the series, so there's not much I can say now. But I think you guys get the gist, which is why I'm gonna close with this. I am not the biggest fan of two-parter films. I get why they're there, I see the reasoning behind them, and I've seen them work out well. But I'm not convinced that this should become a trend. I've seen way too many bad examples and exploits, and it's starting to ease its way back in as yet another avenue for modern day companies to squeeze out more cash. Then again, this could spark franchises, existing or non, that learn from these mistakes and make two-parters that stand against the test of time. But I guess we won't know until whoever steps up to the plate dares to give it a go, whenever they give it a go. Thank you all for watching, and have a spectacular rest of your day.